Brandon Hunt. I'm the pastor of St. Philip Lutheran Church in Trenton, Michigan, on Fort Street. If you're familiar with the Downriver area between King and Harrison. And this Zoom forum on spirituality and the Great Lakes, it's part of our Perennial Waters Project that is a ministry of St. Philip. And so what's going to happen is I'm going to give a brief overview of the Perennial Waters Project and how we got to where we are. Then I'm going to hand it off to Dr. John Hartig, who's going to introduce Dan. And then Dan's going to talk with some really wonderful words and statements for 30 minutes. And then we'll have questions. So before we begin, a couple years ago, we were thinking about the environment and the world around us. And, you know, coming from a Christian church and a Christian perspective, it's a no-brainer that as Christians, our church is called to care for the environment and the world around us. Martin Luther, who's kind of like our founder, leader person back in the day, he wrote that God writes the gospel and God's love, not in just the Bible, but the trees and the water and the flowers and all that. So for us, this is a very important thing for us to follow. And so we got together, me, John Hartig, and Wynn Crofink, who is a member of St. Philip, and we thought, how can our church here in Trenton work towards environmental justice and advocacy and education and all that? And so we've started this fun kind of project thing where we've hosted a couple forums, one in person in 2019 when John Hardig gave a talk on the 50th anniversary of the burning of the Rouge River. Early on in the COVID pandemic in 2020, we hosted an online forum in which we were able to have people in Downriver get to hear stories from people, residents in the Detroit area and the Rouge River area who are affected by Zug Island and all the gas and all the pollution that comes with that. And we got to hear their story and start to build relationships and get to know each other better. And now we have Dan Robinson here who's going to give a presentation, and we're going to have questions. Another thing about our Perennial Waters project that we're very excited about is we are going to break ground on our property in March with a pollinator garden. And next after that, we are going to have a rain garden put in there. And then eventually in the fall, we hope to create a sort of community garden in which community members can come and plant things and take fruits and vegetables or, you know, whatever, you know, grows in gardens, and we can have that. And then the next final part of our project is to create a sort of walking path with like nature facts so that our preschoolers can walk around and learn about creation, and our Sunday school kids can learn about nature and creation and all that, and members of the community can come and sit on a bench in nature and just, you know, just enjoy this creation. And so that's our plans, and this is where we are now. And part of our project is we look for community members who would like to be involved with the project. If you or your family would like to help plant plants in the pollinator garden or help us put together the rain garden or whatever kind of like naturey things that you would like to be involved in, we would like to hear from you all. And of course, you don't have to be a member to like be a part of that. We just want to have folks in the community come and share their gifts and skills with us. So that's where we are and where we're looking to go. And I'm very excited to have you all here today. So now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. John Hartig, who's going to introduce Dan. There you go, John.
Thanks, Pastor. We're honored tonight to hear from Dan Robinson, a writer, a musician, a radio host, a lover of the Great Lakes. Dan has lived and traveled throughout the entire Great Lakes Basin and presently makes his home in Wolf River in Wisconsin. He earned his master's in theological studies and served for 30 years in a variety of ministries in the Christian tradition, including justice, education, campus ministry, music ministry, and youth and family ministries, working in partnership with rural, suburban, Black, and Indigenous communities. Dan heads up the Great Lakes Spirituality Project that shares stories, conversations, and reflections around the spirituality of the Great Lakes Basin. The title of Dan's talk this evening is Healing Waters, Growing Spirituality of the Great Lakes. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, John. And thanks, everybody. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
All right. Good. First off, thanks all around to Pastor Brandon and the St. Philip Church community for sponsoring this evening, and for John and Wynn Curlfink and all their work with the Perennial Waters Project and hosting me here this evening. I also want to express some gratitude to all the people that have talked and been interviewed by the Great Lakes Spirituality Project, some of which you'll hear from tonight, or at least hear their words. And also, as John mentioned, I live near the Wolf River in Shawano, Wisconsin. It's about 45 minutes northwest of Green Bay. And so I want to start with an expression of gratitude and acknowledgement for the people for whom this is their ancestral land, with sharing a land acknowledgement statement that my wife and I have hanging on the wall near our front door. We recognize that we reside on the traditional land of the Menominee people. We honor them, the Omaknamanewa, or Menominee, who have cared for this land throughout the generations, and we pay our respects to elders both past and present. Natanamoe Maknak, which means all my relatives. So I'm going to do a screen share here, and we're going to get started with the presentation. There we go. Well, as John said, healing waters, growing into a spirituality of the Great Lakes. I like to use that phrase, growing into, because that spirituality is already here. It's present in the water, in the land, in the people, in the creatures, the wisdom that's handed down, and the new ideas that arise from this ecosystem. So it's really not for anyone to, especially not me, to discover or create, but rather for all of us together to grow into, to learn, and to share. So a story first. Yeah, there we go. This was a number of years ago. My family and my sister-in-law's family, my wife's sister and her family, the two families went to visit my eldest daughter, who was working at a church camp in the North Woods of Wisconsin. And after spending some time with her, we drove about 90 minutes to the shore of Lake Superior, and we were on a high area looking out over the lake. And this was a particularly emotional, challenging time for our families. And, just being there at the lake, and it was just wonderful. I was breathing in this air and feeling the moisture of the lake in the air and smelling it and just looking out over this wonderful vista. And I tried to describe how I was feeling to my sister-in-law, and I was doing a lousy job of it. Words were just stumbling out, and I just couldn't find anything that could adequately express how I felt at that moment, the connection I felt to the divine, to God, the responsibilities that I felt calling up in that moment. And so that, I don't know if you've had experiences like that or not. I know I've had other moments like that where the words were just hard to describe that connection. Well, that's kind of what resulted in the Great Lakes Spirituality Project. Well, speaking of moments, we're all in one, aren't we, right now? The pandemic, the horrific systemic racial discrimination and violence and white supremacy that's growing in our country, the economic struggles that come from the pandemic, our democracy under attack as evidenced by the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, and the ongoing crisis of climate change. All these things kind of bring up the question, well, with all this going on, why have or deal with the question of a spirituality of the Great Lakes? Why do that now? Well, for me, all these things are reminders that we can't keep doing things the way we've been doing them and expect different or better results. That, as Albert Einstein would say, is the definition of insanity. Well, Sister Caroline Sullivan, a Catholic sister who was one of my first interviews for the project, asked the simple question, how will we be different after the pandemic? Well, that question applies to many things in our lives, including the Great Lakes Basin, which is facing its own set of challenges. Toxic pollution and runoff, invasive species, algal blooms, climate change, and inequitable access to clean drinking water, just to name a few. And I'm thinking about Flint, Michigan, and the problem of lead poisoning in the water, But also we find it now with people being threatened with water shutoffs in the middle of a pandemic when access to clean water is crucial or even life-saving. So whether our relationship with the Great Lakes is an emotional one, like I talked about earlier for myself, or a practical one in terms of access to water, access to jobs, whatever, now is the time we need to re-examine how we connect with these waters, with the people and all the life found here and the ecosystem of the basin as a whole to make sure that we don't keep doing the same thing over and over. And I think spirituality has a role to play in that. So just real briefly about the Great Lakes Spirituality Project. The mission of the project is to further develop a spirituality of the lake that values and protects the Great Lakes Basin and the life that depends on these waters. So just a couple points to mention there. Further develop is that idea of that spirituality is already here. It's just a matter of sharing it and growing into it. But in the phrase, the Great Lakes Basin, it's all the waters of the big 5 lakes, as well as the rivers and lakes, the land and plants, and all the beings in this ecosystem. The goals of the project are pretty straightforward: to share stories and conversations and reflections around the spirituality of the Great Lakes Basin, to add another spiritual voice to the work of protecting the lakes, and to serve as a connecting point for spiritual and religious communities and individuals caring for the lakes and the waters that feed them, which is what we're doing tonight. We're connecting over Zoom to do this. The project is, the main way of achieving these goals right now is a blog that I publish at jailspirit.com, which is a mixture of posts about interviews that I've conducted, including John Hartig and Wynn Curlfink, and also a few reflections of my own. Now, when I say the word spirituality, it's probably good to just briefly talk about what I mean by that. Spirituality is how we see ourselves connected to the greater reality in which we live, how we feed and sustain that connection, and how we practically respond to that connection in our lives. You know, the string that binds me to the lakes is of the same material that binds me to the wider reality around me, to the presence of the divine, to my understanding of God and people and community and nature and my place in the world, and, you know, really all the big stuff. My first interview for the project was with Dave Dempsey. He's a former member of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission and former policy advisor for the International Joint Commission for the Great Lakes. And he currently serves as a policy advisor for the group for Love of Water, or FLOW, which is an environmental group out of Traverse City. Dave's also a writer, and in his book, Lake Nation, he refers to the Great Lakes as sacred places because the lakes provide 20% of the world's fresh water. And in my conversation with him for the project, he said, if you looked at it simply as a natural resource, you would consider it socially sacred. We need the clean water for our future, but it's a special place unlike any other in the world. And I think it awakens a lot of spiritual reactions from people who live or visit the Great Lakes. So for him, and I would agree, he thinks that spirituality is central to protecting the lakes. A few caveats about spirituality. My view is limited, just like everybody's, in every one individual's. It's limited by my background, by my worldview. For example, you know, in the Western European American tradition, we talk about spirituality as kind of a religion, as a kind of a separate thing from the rest of our lives. One of the conversations I had was with Katie Brizette, an Ojibwe woman who's a farmer and educator with Dynamite Hill Farms on traditional Ojibwe land in the Michigan's UP. And during my conversation with her, she said, a lot of people have this real big misconception of culture and spirituality and all of these other things that are these other levels and layers that have been added upon the fundamental relationships we have with each other. Spirituality, that's an English term. We, Ojibwe people, wouldn't even delineate or separate out our culture or our spirituality. So there's a lot of ways to look at this question of spirituality. For the project's purposes, you know, it's all inclusive of different religious traditions, both personal and communal, acknowledging the negative that spirituality and religion has sometimes caused in the world, from religious wars to justification for inaction on climate change. But it's also been a force for good. You look no further than, for example, the civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other Christian leaders, and also to a host of religious traditions, as Pastor Brendan mentioned earlier, that are trying to address environmental issues and climate change. Also, the idea that spirituality means practical action. It's not enough to say we feel something about the Great Lakes. True spirituality is about our entire lives, and that includes the actions and how we live our lives. And finally, I continue to believe that spirituality is another entry point for people who might not consider themselves environmentalists, also care about the lakes. We need to connect with new people, and I think this is a way to do it. Now, that's a lot of stuff to throw at you, and I kind of want to give you a moment to think about the Great Lakes in your own life. So I have a couple reflection questions here. We're literally going to take just a minute to think about these. So the questions are there on the screen, and I want you to just reflect a little bit on your own life and your connection with the lakes. So let's talk a little bit about the conversations that I've been having for the Great Lakes Spirituality Project. The project's been going on for a little less than a year, and during that time, I've had about 17 interviews with about 20 different people for the project, and these are some of the themes that I've gleaned from those conversations and the work of the project. At the core of these have been themes of water, place, relationships, and environmental justice. And then there's also what I'll call supporting themes of spirituality and science, grief and hope, interfaith, and responsibility to act. And there's a lot more I could touch on from these conversations, but for a limited time tonight, I'm just going to focus on these themes. So let's start with the core themes. In particular, let's start with water. I can't tell you how many times I heard the phrase in these conversations, water is life or water is sacred, both in practical and symbolic ways. For example, in my conversation with Katie Brissett, who I said was an Ojibwe woman, which is part of the Anishinaabe people, she said, why is water itself considered sacred? Because the water is where you're going to find food. It's where you're going to find your shelter. Where do you go when you're lost in the wilderness? What's the first thing you have to do? You have to find water. How you are even born or brought to this place, it's because of water. Now, along with Katie, I talked with her partner, Jerry John Rowe, and leading, who also is in charge of the Dynamite Hill Farms. And he said, we're in the heart of Turtle Island. We exist on the arteries of this place as Anishinaabe people. That's Ojibwe, that's Odawa, that's Potawatomi. The Great Lakes is us. And all the waterways that go out as main arteries of that turtle are places that we have traversed and cared for. And it's been a part of our life. Another example is from the Islamic tradition. I talked with Huda Alkaf, who's the head of Wisconsin Green Muslims, and she ended up writing a column for the project. And she wrote about what she called an important water story in Islam, the story of Mother Hajar, wife of Prophet Ibrahim and mother of Prophet Ismail. It's a story that emphasizes the important role that Muslim women play in Islam, she said. Millions of people every year are making the Hajj pilgrim to Makkah and follow in the footsteps of Mother Hajar as they perform their Hajj, moving from one hill to the other, as she did, searching for water for her thirsty baby son. Alkaf said that Mother Hajar had complete trust in God. She is a true example of a brave and pious woman who knew that she had not been abandoned in the desert and that she had a role to play in God's great design. She discovered Zemzem water, the holy water that keeps on giving life until today. So water is important. It's an important spiritual and religious symbol because it is essential to life. So the next theme, sacredness of place. The idea that this place, the ecosystem of the Great Lakes Basin, is sacred in a unique way. I mean, all places can or are thought of as being sacred, but each one is sacred in its own unique way, and that's true of the Great Lakes. And how does that affect our spirituality? Well, I want to share with you a conversation I had with Dr. Patty Lowe, a member of the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe, and professor in the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, and also director of Northwestern's Center for Native American and Indigenous Research. She talked about the difference between Native spirituality and the three main Western religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. All three of these, she said, are liturgical and portable. They focused around events of the year, and the worship practices of these religions can take place anywhere. You can take your sacred objects with you, like a prayer rug or a set of rosary beads, but for indigenous people, she said, it's different.
You know, native communities have at their center this sacred place. And community that I've visited, really the traditional people have this, you know, whether it's Oneida and their standing stone back in New York, the present day New York, or the Ho-Chunk with their place of origin, and Mogashute, Red Banks near Green Bay, or the Menominee, you know, with their origin stories on the Menominee River. There are these places that are sacred, and everything worth remembering emanates from that place. And so when people practice their spirituality, it's connected to that place. They're not praying for good fortune or good health or redemption. It's their, native religions are basically have, the adherents of these nature-based religions are praying for that place, for the health of that place, which means you can't be anywhere else and practice your religion. Your religion is place-based. And so when we have these struggles between corporate rights and sacred sites, there isn't that understanding that a place itself is sacred, because legislators and developers don't see stained glass, they don't see spires, they don't see all the things that we associate with the big three religions. And in the case of my reservation, when the Wisconsin legislature was debating the mining bill, one of the legislators came up and looked over and said, "What's the big deal? I mean, it's nothing but a bunch of weeds." He didn't see sacredness of our wild rice. He just saw weeds. And that's a really difficult thing to get across.
So another example of sacredness of place is Dr. Christopher Fichi, who is a professor of religion, but also a practitioner of bhakti yoga in the Hindu tradition, said to me, "My experiences of the lakes have become deeper because in the very same sense that I would approach the Ganges River in India as being a sacred manifestation of a divinity, that's how I feel towards the Great Lakes. That whole deep understanding of the sacredness of water, and that we actually directly encounter and have intimate relationship with the divine through water. That is something I take with me every time I go to the lake." So the dominant culture in the US, and I suspect in Canada as well, is mobile. We move around a lot. But I believe if we don't love any one place, then we can't love the planet as a whole. It's this principle of commitment to place, even in the midst of a mobile society, that calls us and helps us heal the spot where we live and love, and in turn help heal the earth. Next theme, relationships. I like using that phrase, healing waters, because how you understand that phrase depends on whether you think healing is an adjective or a verb. If it's a verb, then we are the ones doing the healing. We are healing waters as we repair the damage to these waters. But if it's an adjective, then it's the water doing the healing. These healing waters healing us in the struggles that we have in this life. The pandemic, at least for me, has brought that into focus, as I, and I suspect many others of us, have been seeking out the waters of the Great Lake for calm, for healing, for peace. And the water provides practical help as well in keeping us clean, sanitary, and safe from the coronavirus, like when we wash our hands. So it's a reciprocal relationship. We have a responsibility to heal the damage we've done, and in turn, the waters of the Great Lakes heal us. So some examples of that. Again, going back to Jerry Jondreau and up in Michigan's UP and on Dynamite Hills Farms. He talked about the land of the farms this way. These forests, these trees, these plants, they are my relatives as well. So as we get recycled with the nutrient cycles, my ancestors, my great grandmother who used to live back in those woods, her hair is part of that. Her skin that she shed is part of that. So even on a much deeper level, these are my relatives. This is my family. Great Lakes and personal health. Wynn's on the call tonight, and he's obviously involved with the Perennial Waters Project there at St. Philip. Well, he is also a therapist working with people trying to recover from addiction. And in our conversation, he drew the parallel between the Great Lakes, particularly the region there in Southeast Michigan, and personal well-being, saying precisely the same reverence that I have for my own physical well-being as I do for this particular region. So my personal recovery in my addictive behaviors is no different than the recovery of the Great Lakes ecosystem. So in other words, we are as healthy as the environment around us. And finally, LIBOR, which some of you may be familiar with that acronym. In 2019, a majority of the voters in Toledo, Ohio, voted to give Lake Erie the same rights as a person and to allow residents to sue for those rights on behalf of the lake. And it was called the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, or LIBOR. And it was ruled unconstitutional by a court in Ohio, but passage of that law or that ordinance or resolution demonstrated a change in the relationship between people and the ecosystem around them. There's a great TED Talk out there by a woman named Kelsey Leonard, who's a member of the Shinnecock Nation and who represents the nation on the Great Lakes Water Quality Board of the International Joint Commission. And in her talk, she asks if the American legal system grants personhood to corporations, then why not the Great Lakes? She goes on to say, this is not something new for us as indigenous peoples. Our indigenous legal systems have a foundational principle of understanding our non-human relations as being living and protected under our laws. And then the last of the core themes, environmental justice. For the purposes of this project, environmental justice means people of color and folks on low incomes shouldn't bear the brunt of environmental hazards and health risks, that they have as much right to a clean environment as anyone. And in fact, we know we'll have environmental justice when people of color and people on low incomes have equitable access to a clean environment. Now, for those of us who are white and have the privilege of not having to think about this stuff all the time, this past year has served as a painful reminder that so much of justice in general, and environmental justice in particular, fall along lines of color, race, and income. Blacks, indigenous communities, and people of color experience discrimination, racism, and violence because of white supremacy, and the problem is growing. But when we look at the Great Lakes Basin, a region rich with water resources, we see again that horrific example of the people in Flint, a predominantly Black community having to drink water poisoned with lead. But it's not only Flint. Access to clean water is essential during a pandemic, and yet we as a society are failing communities of color by not guaranteeing that. For example, in the fall of 2019, 3 environmental organizations, the Natural Resources Defense Council, Coming Clean, and the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. All 3 collaborated on an analysis of violations of the Safe Drinking Water over a course of 3 years, from 2016 to 2019. And they wrote a report called Watered Down Justice, which showed they called a disturbing relationship between clean drinking water violations and communities of color. And it wasn't just violations, but it was also enforcement of those laws that was slow and inadequate in counties that had a high number of residents of color or people living on low incomes. Now, that's true according to the report for 4 counties in the Great Lakes Basin, and it's also true for an additional 8 counties in the basin that have a moderate number of people on low income or people of color living there. Now, that may not seem like a high number, 4 counties, 8 counties, and while I would say even 2 or even 1 is too many, but think about that for a moment. Poor families and people of color lack equitable access to clean water in a region where water is a defining characteristic. So, environmental justice is a lens through which we need to see all Great Lakes issues and a goal towards which our work must lead. So, those are the four main themes: water, relationships, place, and environmental justice that came from the interviews and the work of the project. Briefly, here are those four supporting themes. Responsibility. We are responsible to actually do something, to make a real difference in caring for the earth. Here's an example. Rabbi Jonathan Beich of Temple Beth El in Madison, Wisconsin, talked about the Jewish concept of tikkun olam.
So tikkun olam, we understand to mean the repair of the imperfect world. We believe that when God created the world, whenever that was, that the world needed improvement. That's why we all, humanity, the animal kingdom, the nature, all have to work together in order to bring about more perfection. We have as maybe a sort of a general mission to create a pathway to repair the world. Some people do it exclusively through a relationship with God in our community. But in other communities, other Jewish communities, as well as ours, other people believe that that act of repair has to be initiated through us. We can be inspired by God. We read the Torah, we understand what God sort of expects of us, but we can't rely upon that connection to God to be the sole arbiter of what happens here. We have to be involved. We are God's stewards on this planet. Again, that conception again of our stewardship of this world. And so we have to be prepared in order to make this world a better place through our own actions.
So that's that sense of responsibility. Another theme, secondary supporting theme, is science and spirituality. There's a lot of science going on in the Great Lakes, and we know a lot about what's happening and what we need to do to understand and fix things. We've got a lot to learn, but science is at the heart of the work to heal the Great Lakes Basin. I was talking with Reverend John Magnuson, who's a Christian minister in Michigan's UP and executive director of the Cedar Tree Institute. He talked about the relationship between spirituality and science, how spirituality brings gifts to science, like a different sense of time, rituals, and respecting the individual over ideology, while science, in turn, brings gifts to spirituality, which he said can open us up and involve us into a deeper, wider understanding of the sacred. Grief and hope. In her soon-to-be published book, Meander, Dr. Margaret Wooster, who used to be the head of the group Great Lakes United, she wrote that anger and sorrow are almost guaranteed for anyone who becomes attached to a natural place that they're trying to protect. Now, when she said that, she was referring to her work to protect the Oxbow, a place along the Buffalo River in western New York State. I could even get weepy over this, she said. 13 years I've been at it with the Oxbow, and for what, you might say? Because I don't think I've made much of a dent in the Oxbow itself, but it's made a huge dent in me. I just love to be there. On the hope side, Dr. Nancy Langston, a professor of environmental history at Michigan Tech University and an atheist, talked about her spirituality. She talked about hope in the short and long run. Now, in the long run, being an environmental historian, she thought about the mass extinctions that have taken place over the life of the earth, and yet life survives and thrives. That's the really long run. In the short run, she said, there are still massive numbers of people really trying to go above and beyond their jobs. I mean, they do their jobs, but they also really, really love the lakes and the species that inhabit this amazing Great Lakes ecosystem. So that's hopeful. People still care. And that was a consistent view that I got. The work of each of us in turn gives hope to each of us. And then finally, interfaith. Caring for the environment in general and the Great Lakes Basin in particular is something around which people gather. Dr. Dan Weber he's a scientist and also a devout Jew, and he served on the board of Interfaith Power and Light in the Milwaukee area, which is a group dedicated to combating climate change. About his time on the board, Dr. Weber said, one of the things that has truly impressed me here is that we have people coming from all different kinds of religious backgrounds. We walk different paths, we have different rituals, we look at the world differently sometimes, but we all end up in the same place. And how we get there is very different. We have different assumptions as to how does the world work, and what do we mean by what's divine? What do we mean by what's ritually important? But when it comes to morality, and when it comes to how do you apply that morality to life and to the environment, we all end up in the same place. So those are the 4 supporting themes. So after all of that, we just want to take a moment again to give us a chance to reflect a little bit on those 4, particularly those 4 core themes, and how they might connect to your spirituality or your faith. So after looking at those themes, you may ask yourself, and I think you'd be right to ask, so what? What difference does all this make, and what does spirituality practically have to do with caring for the lakes? Well, spiritual people and communities can do lots of things, and Perennial Waters is an excellent example of that. Another one might be being politically active, motivated by your spirituality or your faith, and advocate for things like the funding of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which has pumped hundreds of millions of dollars over the last decade into repairing the damage we've done to the lakes. I think, though, that spiritual people and communities have a unique role to play in caring for the lakes. And here's one possible, among many, one possible way to carry out that role. The prophetic circle. I kind of came up with this as my riff on the work of Walter Brueggemann. So my apologies to him, coming from his book, The Prophetic Imagination. In that book, he said the job of the prophet in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, from Moses through Jeremiah to Jesus, is to look at the dominant culture in which we live and how it is damaging and killing us, particularly those who are poor or oppressed, to grieve over that oppression and loss of life, to critique that culture, and to offer an alternative vision and energy to the dominant culture, a vision of justice and compassion based on the radical love and freedom of God, which I would add can lead to the creating of a new life-giving culture. So let's take an example that a lot of us are probably familiar with, at least from the news. What happened in 2020 around the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many other Black men and women. First, there was grief and anger expressed during those demonstrations this past summer. There was critiquing and a call for dismantling of how things had been done in the past, dismantling of systems of white supremacy, from some police practices to the political process, to even whether or not Black people are welcomed in outdoor spaces as bird watchers. Visioning and energy. We saw the continued rise of the Black Lives Movement, a vision that says Black people matter whether the dominant culture says they don't. And then creating a new future is the responsibility of all of us, but leaders do matter. So people like President Kamala Harris, Stacey Abrams in Georgia, and I'm thinking of Cori Bush, a local leader in Missouri in the Black Lives Matter movement, who became the first Black woman elected to Congress from Missouri. We can and are electing people who are in a position to create a new future. And that in turn can create hope. So, using that as kind of a blueprint, how does this apply to the Great Lakes? Grief and hope. This is a necessary step if we're to take an honest look at the situation we're in. And earlier I talked about Margaret Wooster and the grief she felt in trying to protect the oxbow on the Buffalo River. Critiquing and dismantling. Again, earlier I referred to the TED Talk by Kelsey Leonard, a member of the Shinnecock Nation who critiqued the American legal system By asking if it can grant personhood to corporations, then why not the Great Lakes? She compared it to the indigenous legal system that recognized the rights of non-human beings. So in a sense, calling for a dismantling of how the dominant culture's legal system operates in terms of nature and the beings with whom we share this ecosystem. Visioning and energizing. And now this is where the core themes come in that I talked about earlier. The idea that water is sacred, that water is life, the importance of a sense of place, mutually healing relationship with nature, and environmental justice. All these provide a vision for what we can become, and they help energize us to move forward. And then creating. And this is where the supporting themes like science and spirituality, responsibility, and interfaith come in, because these are ways we can go about creating a new reality. You know, I talked about Jerry Gendreau and Katie Brissett's Dynamite Hills Farm. Well, that farm is creating a new and different future as one example, building on Ojibwe values that respect the land, water, and all the life there as brothers and sisters. And again, I refer back to the Perennial Waters Project at St. Philip is another example of creating a different future, a better future. So in terms of the Great Lakes, the prophetic circle asks a lot of us. In grief, you know, how could the spiritual community and the traditions help people of the Great Lakes Basin acknowledge and grieve the damage that's been done to the watershed and to the life around the lakes? What would a critique of dominant culture and modes of living in the Great Lakes look like, especially when communicated in spiritual or religious terms? Does stewardship of the water question or critique our culture of overconsumption? Can we dismantle a culture of white supremacy that shoves our most polluting industries into low-income communities and communities of color and devalues the inherent dignity of each person living there? With visioning and energy, how can individual spiritual and religious communities point us towards a different way of living that is based on such spiritual values like respect for the dignity of all people and all creation, self-sacrifice, and responsibility to a higher power? Can those in leadership, or those who are willing to voice their views publicly, put forth a vision of how to be in a healthier relationship to the Great Lakes Basin ecosystem, but to do that in religious and spiritual terms that will speak to their community members? And then creating. What role can spiritual and religious communities play in projects that are not typically thought of as efforts by those communities? For example, is there a place in supporting alternative energy projects like solar gardens? Or is sharing information from Great Lakes scientists, or even advocating for government policy combating invasive species? So all of this leads back, again, hopefully to hope, but eventually to grief. You know, you can argue that there's a process to this, but really, I didn't put arrows on this circle because, you know, life is messy, right? You know, it doesn't always go in a predictable fashion. And events can happen in random order. The circle is imperfect because we're imperfect, but it keeps on going. And so henceforth, that image of a circle. So I want to close my time with this quote. I was talking with Ched Myers, who is a Christian theologian, and he quoted Baba Diom, the Senegalese environmentalist, when he said, "We won't say places we don't love. We can't love places we don't know, and we don't know places we haven't learned." So my hope for the Great Lakes Spirituality Project is to be a small part of helping all of us learn more about the Great Lakes. And in learning more, we can know them better. And in knowing them better, we can truly love them and all the life that depends on them. Thank you. And I will stop sharing here. All still there. Sweet. All right. So John, you're muted.
Thanks so much, Dan. Maybe to get us started, in all your conversations and podcasts that you've had, have you seen where kind of an ecumenical collaboration to on a vision or on action?
Well, you know, it's funny you should ask that because I mentioned the conversation I had with Dan Weber, who was on the Interfaith Power and Light. And he gave, these conversations come about a lot of times because I get referred to future people from people I've already talked to. And he was saying, oh, I should talk to the folks at Interfaith Power and Light. So I think that's one example. I just haven't had a chance to talk to them yet. So that's probably the best example in terms of of strictly environmental work that I can think of. But what happens, I think, a lot of times is you will look at ecumenical groups that are together on a host of issues, and environmentalism will be a piece of that, not necessarily specifically to the Great Lakes or water issues. There's a network of religious community-based organizing going on in Wisconsin, and they deal with a host of issues. But environmental issues are one of them. So I think that kind of organizing is going on right now. But in terms of strictly for environmental stuff for Great Lakes, Interfaith Power and Light is probably the best example I can think of that I've run across so far.
So Dan, a bunch of questions are coming in, obviously, which is good. How about if I throw one you?
Sure.
Are there ways to bring faith into practice of science? Or are these two different ways of knowing, two different, keep God out of the lab?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's funny, again, to bring up Dan Weber, that was one of the things he talked about. And it wasn't so much that I heard him saying that his faith, his spirituality was affecting in some practical way the science that he was doing. The person who asked that question talked about two different ways of knowing. I think a lot of times we end up separating those as being different spheres that don't have anything to do with each other. But for him, he saw them as very complementary because they asked different questions. Both of them ask about relationships. Science asks about relationships between what is a relationship, causal or not effect, between this thing and that thing, or this process and that process. In spirituality, we talk about relationships too. It's just a different way. And I think what I saw for him was that his spirituality was a motivator, was a framer of questions, but it didn't necessarily affect his science. But then in terms of what he discovered in science affected how he believed his spirituality and his faith in the world. So I think he saw them as complementary, and I would definitely agree with that.
That's great. Another one, Dan, what are churches doing to support the idea of rights of nature? Is this controversial concept among contemporary theologians?
Well, I don't feel like I can speak to that in any kind of authoritative way because we haven't dealt a lot of it beyond what I said in this presentation in the project. I will say that when we talk about rights of nature, you can talk about that in a formal and an informal sense. There's the formal sense of the legal rights. And I don't know of any church that is involved in any kind of legal issues, although I suspect it was probably a topic of conversation in Toledo when that vote was going through. So there may have been some churches down there that were dealing with that. But in an informal sense, I think the theology and the way of operating of some churches do take seriously this sense that we are one amongst many within creation. I was joking before we got on the thing started that I had about an hour and a half of a presentation and I had to cut it down to less than half. And one of the pieces I took out was a really interesting couple pages from a book that talked about the ways we look at our relationship with nature within the Judeo-Christian tradition. We're in charge and nature's just there to fulfill our needs, or we're just one among many, or some sort of combination of the two. And I kind of look at it a little bit differently. We are one among many. We're not in charge. God is in charge, or the divinity is in charge. But we have a role to play. And so I think that that role that's unique to us, like it's unique to trees, like it's unique to fish, I think that role is important. And part of that role is recognizing the rights of those other beings in creation to fulfill their role as well.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Another one, how does spirituality relate to climate change and issues like water level fluctuations?
Wow, great questions. Well, again, not being an expert on these things, just kind of a little bit that I know from this project. I think spirituality in part has to do with how we relate to, like I said, all the big stuff, God, the world around us. And certainly there's no question bigger in terms of the environment than climate change right now. And then we need to look at the things that have contributed to climate change: overconsumption, a lack of respect for the resources that God has blessed this world with. So I think that from a spiritual perspective, climate change, like I would argue other ills that we're experiencing in our society right now, is an outcome of a lack of care and respect for the gift of the world that God has given us. I think there are some traditions within the Christian tradition, some churches and communities within the Christian tradition who kind of have an exclusive sort of focus on the next life. I just got to get through this life. I got to do the things I got to do in this life, check these boxes, and then I'm going to get to heaven. I don't really care about what's happening here. And that's a way of approaching the spiritual question of climate change, because I don't care about climate change because I'm not sticking around. But I think a spirituality that respects the gifts and the blessings of this world that God has created and has put us in the middle of, along with the other beings, I think that kind of spirituality calls us to address climate change. So I think there's a split in how the Christian community approaches that, and that comes out of how we have our spiritual perspective on the world.
Dan, the concept of 7 generations coming from First Nations, what can governments learn from the concept of 7 generations?
That was another section I cut out of the talk, I'm afraid, tonight. Dr. Patty Lowe had a really nice section on talking about 7-generation thinking from the Anishinaabe people as well as the Haudenosaunee out east. So I used to be a local elected official. I was on city council in the town that I lived in, and I was also on the county board for a while. And I was in my, late 30s, early 40s at the time. And I remember sitting in a council meeting, and we were talking about trying to do a study so we could do another study, so we could do another study. Eventually, down the road, 20 years down the road, we could get permission to build this bypass and relieve the bridge, the amount of traffic that was damaging the roads in our downtown of our little town. And I remember sitting there on the board thinking, 20 years, good grief, 20 years. Do we really need to worry about this now when it's 20 years down the road? Now that I'm older, we're talking 15, 20 years later, I'm thinking 20 years, oh my gosh, that goes like that, And so I think that what 7th generation thinking does, it reminds us that time it flows by quickly. And the things that we do now are going to affect people down the road. Now, I think in the dominant culture in our society, I think we talk about our grandchildren. How is this going to affect my grandchildren? It's that same kind of thinking. It's just not as extended as far as 7th generation thinking does. And I think the climate crisis, among others, challenges us to extend our timeline and how we think about things. So I think that's a necessary way. It's a necessary means of thinking, whether you think of it as 7th generation from indigenous traditions, or whether you think of my great-great-great-grandchildren, whatever it is. I think we need to extend how we think about the climate crisis and the things that we do now to affect things down the road.
Dan, what's your most exciting project coming up?
Oh gosh, my most exciting project. Well, to be honest with you, this was my most exciting project for the moment. I was really looking forward to tonight, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. Some ideas I have around in my head is I'd like to expand into some of and we've talked a little bit about this before. There's a group, Great Lakes Inspired, that John and I are a part of, and that Stephanie Prechter, who's on this call tonight, is heading up. We're having an event coming up soon in March, so watch out for that with John and Stephanie. That group brings together science and the arts and the Great Lakes. Well, I'd kind of like to do that for spirituality, bring together the arts and spirituality in the Great Lakes. I have a few musician friends of mine that I'm thinking, maybe I'll approach them someday, maybe do some live Facebook Live concerts to bring those pieces together and talk about how spirituality affects their music, but also their connection to these waters. So that's something I'd like to explore a little bit.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Dan. Well, I think it's getting close to the hour. If you have some ideas for future programs or some things you would like us to do together and St. Philip to coordinate, you have the email address when you registered for this Zoom presentation. It's stphilip, ELCA, stphilip@gmail.com, and it's St. Philip with one L. So give us some feedback. If you have some ideas, we would love to hear from you. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Pastor Brandon to,
Before
yes,
that, John, could I just say real quick, I encourage everybody to check out our website, glspirit.com, for the Great Lakes Spirituality Project. And we're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So please find us there. We would love to hear from you. You can subscribe to the blog. Sorry, commercial. Thanks, John.
Thanks so much, Dan. Really appreciate it. Pastor?
Yeah, thanks again to Dan for coming and being involved and giving us all this knowledge. And we thank everybody who came out to be a part of the Zoom meeting. We will be having a Perennial Waters. It's perennialwaters.org. Our website will be going up later this week. And please come help us with this community garden and this pollinator garden, because if you've ever seen me plant a flower, you will understand that we need all the help we can get. And so thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful evening. And we hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Dan, I like your haircut.
Thank you. I did it myself. Managed not to butcher it too much.
That's good.
If you go to the website and look at the interviews over the last few months, my hair keeps getting longer and longer and wilder. And I haven't done an interview since I cut it. So that'll be quite the change.
Yeah. We look forward to working with you more in the future, Dan, okay?
I really appreciate y'all welcoming to me tonight. Thank you very, very much. And I'm looking forward to the Great Lakes Inspired event in March.
March 4th. Yeah.
4th.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.